He was born outside of Manchester, England. His dad owned a bicycle shop. He showed a great talent for calligraphy and letter and art in general at a young age. So good, in fact, this is an illumination he did when he was like 11 or 12 years old. He would go to museums and do sketches and do the gilding at home. He was the youngest calligrapher hired by the House of Lords and considered by many to be possibly the talented, if not one of the most talented calligraphers in the Western world. When we talk to students at St. John's University, we say, he is the LeBron James of calligraphy. Now, in your youth, Dick Cable, it was George Mikan. He was the George Mikan of calligraphy, the famous Minneapolis Laker. The way we got to know Donald Jackson was in 1981. There was this first annual International Calligraphy Conference that was hosted in our old basketball gym. And because Donald Jackson was going to be the keynote speaker, over 500 calligraphers from around the world came to St. John's. And believe me, they did not come to St. John's because of St. John's. We're in the middle of nowhere. We are in Lake Wobegon. And Donald Jackson, because he was speaking, he has that sort of status among calligraphers. They wanted to hear him. And the great thing about Donald Jackson is not only is he a fantastic calligrapher, he's a wonderful ambassador for the art. And there's a physicality to this art that you sort of get when Donald talks about it. He sort of gets into these zones and he warms up for it, and he sort of is all in physically and spiritually and emotionally when he talks about and actually does calligraphy. And you sort of get a sense as he's up on that scaffolding in that picture talking to the sea of calligraphers. I've run into more calligraphers since then that said, oh yeah, I was there 1981 at St. John's. It's a little bit like Woodstock. And if as many people were there, we would have needed something much larger than that gym. So in 1995, again, his lifelong dream was actually to handwrite the Bible. He actually mentioned it to Barbara Walters on the Today Show back in '79. And there was a woman by the name of Jo White, who's considered the mother of the St. John's Bible, who unfortunately recently passed. And she was the one that really connected Donald with St. John's as it relates to the St. John's Bible. And he basically made the pitch in 1995, what would you think about commissioning me to handwrite the Bible? We'll use exactly the same tools and materials as medieval days, but we'll make this a Bible for the 21st century. So the 3-year gap that you see, 95 to 98, we affectionately refer to as a period of discernment. So Brother Dietrich Reinhardt, the president, had to get the monastic community on board, the faculty on board, the board of trustees, how are we going to fund it, and so forth. And the contract was signed in 1998. So that's sort of the beginning of the project. Now, when you start something like this, you just don't start writing the Bible. Donald had to put together the artists, St. John's had to put together the scholars, and it really wasn't until 2000 on Ash Wednesday that quill first hit vellum, and the very first words were in the beginning, at the beginning of Gospel of John. So in terms of the art, this is sort of when it really started production-wise. And then 2011 is when it all was completed. This is Abbot John Clausen burnishing a gold cross on the last day of Revelation. Or not the last day of Revelation, good Lord. That would be the last page of Revelation. We're not there yet. We used to joke with the St. John's Bible, when would it be done? And we kept saying, well, I think Revelation is coming in June. But and by the way, these are the scholars that provided the scholarship to the St. John's Bible. They were the ones that decided which verses to illuminate, how much space they would take, and how do we make this a Bible for the 21st century? And so things like care for the poor and care for the sick, the dignity of all people, the embracing of science and discovery, these are some of the things that we're trying to capture. These are the calligraphers. 6 of these calligraphers did the bulk of the work. The gentleman in the black sweater was a Hebrew scribe, Izzy Plodwinski, and he did all the Hebrew or the bulk of the Hebrew in the St. John's Bible. And then these are the artists. So unlike the calligraphers, the artists will bring in their own tradition. So you had traditional artists, more contemporary artists, a natural history artist, and so forth. And the heritage edition that you see, I just want to say a few words about that heritage edition. If you think about the original manuscript is in St. John's. It's in a beautiful gallery, but how much of the world will actually see that? The heritage edition is sort of our way of sharing this with the world. And so the idea was not necessarily sell these to rare book collectors, but rather institutions that would share them with their communities, much like the University of Wisconsin. The key to the heritage edition is the fact that Donald Jackson personally directed the creation of it. So every square millimeter of the book that you see out there, Donald Jackson had a huge influence on the colors, the illuminations, the impressions on the gold. It is, the mantra was, we have to be true to the artistic intent of the original. And that's exactly what happened, thanks to Donald Jackson's work on it. By the way, one of the reasons why this project went way over budget and took a very long time, was he was doing double duty. He was working on the original while he was working on the Heritage Edition, which was very, very difficult. So, and yet, in the final outcome, it was the right thing to do. Donald Jackson really owned this. And in his mind, when you see the St. John's Bible here at the University of Wisconsin, you're seeing the St. John's Bible. I have a little bit of a debate with my colleague, Tim Turnus. Tim is the curator of the original. And here's the debate. Donald Jackson defines illumination as the play of light as you turn the page. He has a certain idea in mind in terms of how the light reflects and refracts off the page. Well, we won't let anybody touch the original. The original is under glass. We have to worry about temperature and humidity control. So in my opinion, what you have is closer to the St. John's Bible than what the original is. Curators will totally disagree with that statement, but that's okay. All right, illuminated encounters. What I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about, okay, now that we've made this beautiful manuscript, thanks to the great work by the artists and the scholars working together for 15 years, how is this meeting the mission? That is, the mission is to ignite the spiritual imagination of people around the world of all faith journeys. Is this actually happening? And so I'm going to go through 10 encounters. And some of the things you'll sort of see through most of these encounters is, in general, these are extemporaneous or spontaneous encounters that weren't really planned. Generally, they're with one or a small group of people. And in my opinion, they are the reason why St. John's created the St. John's Bible. And these are encounters, by the way, that in the future will happen here at the University of Wisconsin. I want to talk a little bit because this is connected directly to this illumination, this illuminated encounters concept. So in Psalms, one of the struggles the scholars and the artists said was, well, how do we illuminate Psalms? Psalms, there's not really a narrative to it. It's a form of worship in song. How do we do this? And during the brainstorming, an interesting idea came up, and that was, well, when the monks are singing during the Liturgy of the Hours, think of the songs as vibrating molecules through space. And by the way, there are other religious traditions out there that also use song. There's something about song and music that it's innate in being human beings. We like to compose it and we like to listen to it. And think of those molecules vibrating through space. And for sure, there's going to be times when these vibrations intersect in some way. And so is there something you can do with that, Donald? And so what Donald's idea was, okay, he recorded the monks singing up at St. John's, their songs, their psalms. He inputted the recording into a digital oscilloscope, and he outputted digital voice prints of the songs. And then he recorded a Jewish men's choir, an Islamic call for prayer, various musical traditions from Native Americans and Hindu and Buddhists and so forth. And you saw throughout the whole volume of Psalms, you will see all these digital voice prints and music prints intersecting. And I want you to think a little bit about the theme of this presentation. These intersections are really the encounters. And certainly there's a lot of encountering that's going on between the various traditions here at the University of Wisconsin. And that's what we really want to celebrate through this presentation. Okay, illuminated encounter number 1, lesson learned. Let me talk about the illumination because this is a very unusual illumination in that 4 different artists worked on this. So you see the face of Moses, which was done by Aidan Hart, who's an icon artist. The general design of this was done by Donald Jackson. The text treatment that you see in the margin was done by Sally Mae Joseph. And then Thomas Engelmeyer did the 10 Commandment tablets. Okay, so that's sort of the basic design of this. I also want to make a point about the celebration of the Jewish roots of Christianity throughout the St. John's Bible. So one thing to point out here, this is the creation scene, so you see, which is actually the frontispiece of Genesis. So you see these 7 slices. You've got this explosion of light, you've got the Ganges Delta, it's a satellite image of the Ganges Delta, and then you see humans in the form of cave paintings in Africa and Australia and so forth. But right here, very in the lower left-hand corner, it's a Jewish term, which the translation is formless void, okay? It's important that that's there because although this is an English Bible that's written completely in English, the very first words are in Hebrew. So we're celebrating the Jewish roots of Christianity on the very first illumination. Now back to Moses. I was presenting this illumination to a Jewish gentleman out in California, And as I was explaining this illumination, I made a rather flip remark. And I said that, the story of Moses always bothered me because, Moses goes through this huge ordeal. He extracts his people from Egypt. He gets them across the desert. Now it's finally time to go into the promised land, and kind of on a technicality. Apparently he didn't follow the instructions from God, and then he sort of took credit for the water that came out and quenched the thirst of his people. And because of that, God wouldn't let him go into the promised land. I said, I want the Hollywood ending. I want Moses to go into the promised land, roll credits, cut, and so forth. And while I was saying this guy's eyes were glazing over a little bit, saying, well, let me just tell you how I'm taught in temple on this. And he goes, by the way, I love this illumination. And the reason I love it is because what we're taught in temple in the Jewish faith is that Moses is a parent figure. At some point, a parent has to let go. A parent has to, and he goes, I love the look on Moses' face in this illumination because that's what it says to me. It doesn't say he feels shorted by God or he's bitter about that whole rock thing, but it's more about he has to let go. What's going to happen to his people? And every parent who sends his kid here, University of Wisconsin, feels the same. I have 5 kids. I felt the same pain as did my wife each of those times. What's going to happen to them? They're out of your control. And that trepidation that you see in his face is something that's really profound. So hence, illuminated encounter number 1 is lessons learned. I've learned an awful lot, actually, from the audience that I present to. Illuminated encounter number 2, classes in session. So just a couple words about these illuminations. This is the Garden of Eden scene and Adam and Eve. And the big idea between the scholars and the artists was celebrating what we know scientifically and from an anthropology standpoint. We believe that the cradle of humanity now is East Africa. They've figured that out by following the mitochondrial DNA, which we've all seen those maps in National Geographic and so forth, and the mitochondrial Eve. It's interesting, in Bibles, we tend to show the hierarchy through the male lineage, and yet biologically, it's the mitochondrial, which is passed down by the mother, sets where people came from. I won't go there in this presentation. But and the other point here, Father Eric Hollis, who I'll quote a lot in this presentation, he likes to make the joke that, well, being from Minnesota, we like to imagine that the Garden of Eden is somewhere in Norway, and hard to get other people on board on that, so let's put it in Africa. It's a lot more colorful. And then let's make the Adam and Eve not Northern Europeans. And so Father Eric Hollis was giving a presentation. Now, you all have heard the term about actors not wanting to work with children or animals. Father Eric Hollis, he was educated at Princeton and Yale. He's not really used to being around children or teaching, and he was asked by someone to present to a 3rd grade class. And he was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be horrible. And of course, they're super squirrely and they're barely listening to it. But what he tells the story of, though, is this, while they were all squirrely and moving in their seats, he put these images up, and there was this young African-American boy who all of a sudden just stopped what he was doing, and he looked at the illumination. And they had a conversation later. It was the first time he had really seen himself in a Bible. He was very familiar with the Bible. His parents took him to church, and they read the Bible at home, but it was the first time he'd really seen himself. And it makes a real profound statement. We've had similar examples of that when we did an exhibit in the Mobile Art Museum, where the security people were saying people were coming out of the museum with tears in their eyes because they've seen themselves. And so it really, I think, speaks to expanding, being more inclusive, and welcoming people from maybe who heretofore had not been part of this Bible. So that was illuminated encounter number 2. Number 3, on the road again. Again, let me talk about the illumination. This is actually a fairly classic, from an image standpoint, classic image of Paul. This was done by Aidan Hart. And you've got all these architectural styles from around the world. Some people have said that Paul actually traveled over 10,000 miles, which is an amazing amount of distance given how you're traveling back in biblical days. And I chose this illumination only because it's the only sort of travel theme I could find of the illuminations, which is tied to the next image. Okay, so picture this. You're Jim Triggs. You've got this huge case which holds a box, and inside the box is this volume of the St. John's Bible. And I was traveling through St. Louis at the time, and I have this huge case, and I have my luggage in my briefcase. It's actually a fair amount of work getting through airports with all this. And we have this special case that you check in as luggage, okay? So I get up to the Southwest counter, And there's this rather serious, to the point ticket agent who I'm working with, and she says, "What's in the box?" And I'm often asked that, and I said, "Well, it's a book." She goes, "A book? What kind of book?" And I said, "It's a Bible." And she very sternly looks at me and says, "Well, I have to see it." And I said, "You're kidding me." And she goes, "No, you have to." So there's this TSA lock. So I get the TSA lock, and I kind of open it a little bit, show her the edge, like, "Let's see, it's a book." She goes, "No, I have to see it." I go, "Oh gosh, this is embarrassing." And I'm getting kind of red at the time because there's people behind me. So I kind of open it a little bit more, and she goes, "You have to open it up, sir." I go, "Okay." So I open it up, and then she goes, and I think it was the Matthew Illumination or something. So I've got the Matthew Illumination over the St. Louis airport. And she goes, "Turn another page." And I look up at her, and she's got this great big smile. And I look back, and there's like an arc of people around me, and then they're saying, "Turn another page, turn a page." So there's sort of impromptu Bible study program in the middle of St. Louis airport. I was completely red. I was completely happy. At the end of it, it was really cool. She, with a big smile, she said, "Thank you, you made my day." And I said, "You made mine." A wise woman. So again, let me start with the illumination. This is, for some people, the most beautiful illumination of St. John's Bible. It's called a wisdom woman. And Donald, when he got the brief from the scholars, he immediately thought of her because he had cut this picture of an elderly woman out of National Geographic, and he had on his bulletin board for like 15 years. And the brief from the scholars was something to the effect of, let's celebrate the beauty of wisdom in a countercultural way. So our culture today says, beauty is the perfect body of a young person, okay? And as we all know, real beauty, sustained beauty, are the grandmotherly eyes of this woman, in that she has a lot of wisdom and a lot of beauty because of all the years she's lived. This is somebody where you want to pull up the chair and pepper her with questions about life. And real beauty is the wisdom that we achieve over a lifetime. And we had this illumination up at Pepperdine's lecture, Bible lecture series. So a little bit of background on Pepperdine. Pepperdine was founded by a Church of Christ member. If you're from the Church of Christ tradition, it's non-denominational. Your religion is centered on the Bible, so they know the Bible inside and out. And there was a woman that was looking at Wisdom Woman, and she was really enamored by it, in that she just thought it was beautiful. She spent like 10 or 15 minutes looking at it, and then she started reading the verses around it. And in the verses around it, the wisdom is written in the she pronoun. And she looked up at me and she goes, "Where is this in the Bible?" And I said, "Oh, I forgot to tell you, we're Catholic. Catholics have extra books. We call them the Deuterocanonical, Deutero being Greek for secondary. Protestants call it apocryphal, of questionable origin and so forth. And her Bible would not have this book of the Bible. In the Old Testament, on the upper right-hand corner, if it's been translated from the Hebrew, which is most of the Old Testament, we show it in Hebrew. And in this particular, this is the Wisdom of Solomon, also called the Book of Wisdom. We show it written in the Greek as sort of let people know what they're looking at. It was a good heads up for me to be better in tune with my audience. And she absolutely loved seeing this illumination and learning more about what a Catholic Bible is all about. I doubt she went home and bought a Catholic Bible, nor was I trying to evangelize her. That wasn't the point, but she loved the art. So it was a wonderful encounter for both of us. Illuminate counter number 5, a Bible blessing. So again, let me talk about the illumination. This is the Matthew frontispiece. It was the first illumination Donald did. And the direction from the scholars was, okay, A, celebrate the Jewish roots of Christianity. And he did it by showing a menorah, the structure of the family tree of Jesus in the shape of a menorah. Donald put Jesus at the top. Wherever you see gold, by the way, in the St. John's Bible, it's meant to represent the presence of the divine, the presence of God. And so you have Jesus here, and then you have all the relatives that connect Jesus to Abraham down here, and it's all in the shape of a menorah. A couple other things I want to point out here. If I go to the very bottom, the Bible tells us that Abraham was married to Sarah and also had relations with Hagar, which is actually written, everything else is written in English and Hebrew, and Hagar is written in English, Hebrew, and Arabic, because this is sort of the descendants of Islam. And so we celebrate that here because it's in the Bible in terms of Hagar and Ishmael written to the right. If you go further up, a couple things to point out. You see these arabesques. So when the Crusaders went to the Holy Lands and then came back home, they brought these arabesque designs that were actually incorporated into Western architecture and have been ever since. So it's interesting to see how when these cultures get together, how they influence each other. The other thing that was, I mentioned how Jesus is encased in gold, the presence of the divine. The scholars said, let's also celebrate both the divinity of Jesus and the humanity of Jesus. Well, the humanity of Jesus is this double helix DNA molecule that you'll see throughout this illumination. That's a way of us celebrating the humanity of Jesus. It's also a timestamp of sorts, in that, let's say 1,000 years from now, someone's looking at this. Well, this must have been created after the 1950s when the DNA molecule was discovered. So there's an awful lot of things like that in the St. John's Bible. I bring up all of that because it sort of all came together in a blessing that was done at Mayo Clinic. Mayo does not have any religious affiliation per se, but they have lots of chaplains from lots of denominations. And I thought it'd be fun to play you the blessing. I'm just going to do the first three, just to give you a sense for the acceptance across the three Abrahamic traditions.
We have on this occasion, as on all joyous occasions in the Jewish tradition, a blessing which thanks God for allowing us to be at this moment. Baruch atah Adonai shehecheyanu v'kiyamanu v'higiyanu lazman hazeh. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, who has given us life, who has sustained us, and who has brought us to this most joyous moment. Amen.
This text begins a new tradition. In the Hebrew, it was called the Bar, the divine word of God, the word that spoke and everything was created, the word that came out of the mouth of God and all came into being. In the Christian tradition, the Greek text, it's called the divine Logos, the word of God taking flesh through Jesus Christ. It is our hope and my blessing that this text, this Bible, will bring hope and healing and health to people who gather here to witness it. Amen.
In the name of God, the most beneficent, the most merciful. In Arabic, Muslims say, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the Quran, we are told that God created all of us from a single man and a single woman and divided us into nations and tribes so that we may know each other's. And this diversity of human race and human faith, what Muslims believe, was intended by God. If he wanted, he could have created all people believe in one thing, but he didn't. The purpose of that is so that we may know each other's, and he can test us with that. So at this moment today, in dedication of this Bible, that includes a variety of faith traditions and it includes a variety of cultural traditions, that is a testament of what God told us in the Quran, that he has created this diversity as a purpose.
As Father said earlier, it seems out of order to bless the St. John's Bible, for indeed its magnificence blesses us. But I would offer these prayerful words. Gracious author of the truth, may the presence of the St. John's Bible in this house of healing and care serve as a connection, harmonizing story, body, spirit, and mind. And may it forever enhance the quest for promise, hope, and peace for those who work at this Mayo Clinic and for those who come here from near and far to be healed. Amen.
Illuminating encounter number 6. Bishop Remy Deroux. Okay, here's the more progressive bishop I promised. First of all, the illumination. This is we title it "The Demands of Social Justice" by Suzanne Moore. This appears in Amos, in the fourth chapter of Amos. Amos was a prophet in the southern part of Israel. He moved to the northern part to preach. The northern part of Israel was very affluent. They were doing well strategically and military-wise, but there was a concern, especially on the part of Amos. The rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer, and they weren't taking care of their own. Certainly a very contemporary topic. And by the way, Amos got kicked out of northern Israel, got sent back into the south, and he's considered a literary prophet because the only way to reach the north was by writing out his prophecies and his teachings. The thing to point out on this illumination is the fact that they're much like creation. There are these 7 slices, but you can see they're all sort of askew. In other words, because they're not taking care of their own, because of their lack of social justice, everything is awry. And that's one of the sort of the interpretations of this illumination. I bring this up because Bishop Remy DeRue is a bishop in Victoria, British Columbia. He was made a bishop at the age of 38 by John Paul XXIII, who was the pope that started Vatican II. He could speak like 4 or 5 or 6 languages, and so he was very influential in North America, among the North American bishops, because he could read everything and translate everything. And he was very, very progressive in Victoria, British Columbia, in terms of pressing the Catholic Church to be looking out more for the care for the needy and so forth. This picture, by the way, was taken when he was about 92. He wanted to be at the canonization of John the 23rd. So he went there, and you have to realize there's a lot of bishops in the world. There's hundreds and hundreds of bishops. So he had no intention or didn't have any thought that he was going to see the Pope, Pope Francis. Well, he was sitting down in his wheelchair. After the ceremonies were over, Pope Francis walked by, and he noticed on Bishop Remy DeRue's finger, he had a Vatican Father's ring. And actually, Bishop Remy DeRue is the last English-speaking bishop that is still alive. He immediately saw it and shook his hand, and then Pope Francis actually kissed his ring. That's not the encounter I want to share, though. The encounter I want to share is Bishop Remy DeRue wanted to bring the St. John's Bible to the University of Victoria, which is a public university, and similar to the group here today at University of Wisconsin, they have an institute for society and religion. And Remy's dream was to bring the St. John's Bible to the University of Victoria. So we went on like a little fundraising mission over a 2-day period, and we had like 6 or 7 presentations to give. And at the time, he was 89, and I was trying to keep up with him. And I was super and I tend to get a little bit, okay, we got to get there at this time, and we got to get set up, and we have to be organized. I'm totally in the zone, what this presentation is going to be about. And we were on the way to the public library in Victoria, and all of a sudden I looked around and like, where's Bishop Remy? We lost Bishop Remy. Oh no, the presentation's in 10 minutes. And I asked his assistant, and she said, oh, sorry, Bishop Remy saw this musician on the street, looked like he hadn't eaten for a while, so he went to the deli to get the guy a sandwich. And suddenly I was kind of like, okay, relax, Jim. Remy's got the right idea here. Yeah, this presentation's important, but so is the poor guy on the street who needs a bologna sandwich or whatever. So anyway, a lot of lessons learned from social justice comes in all scales, and Bishop Remy definitely gets it. Encounter number 9, a late night meal. First of all, this is Life in the Community by Aidan Hart. You've got Mary at the head of the table, you've got 6 apostles to the right and 6 to the left, and the other people are not necessarily saints or individual saints, but basically saints in church history. And you'll see a various garb that gives you an indication of where they're from around the world. This is one of the few indications of where this came from. The chapel on the upper left-hand corner and this bell tower are modeled after structures at St. John's University. We didn't want this to be a postcard for St. John's, but this is one of the few illuminations that we show something about ourselves in it. Again, a beautiful illumination by Aidan Hart. This is like a curator's nightmare. So you've got this, and by the way, this is the trade edition of the St. John's Bible, not the Heritage edition. So, but you got the Big Mac and the soda and the fries and everything. So the story, the encounter here, let me give you a little background before I read it. So Jason Engel is a graduate of St. John's and an ambassador for the St. John's Bible. He's given lots of talk on our behalf in the greater Chicago area. And he and I gave a talk at the University of Chicago. If you know anything about the University of Chicago, it's in a little tougher part of Chicago. And we didn't get out of there till like 10 o'clock, and I had to be somewhere else. And the next day he was giving another presentation, so he had a Heritage Edition volume in his trunk. He was super hungry because we hadn't eaten since like 4 or 5. So he stops at a McDonald's, and he brings this little Bible that he likes to read when he eats by himself. So he brought that in with him, and he gets engaged by this homeless person that turns out to be a former addict who had found Christianity and wanted to talk to Jason. And Jason's just the kind of guy, I mean, I would have been like, don't talk to me because we're all a little insecure about situations like that. Jason's the kind of guy who says, yeah, come on, sit down with me and we'll talk. And he finds out not only was he very into his religion, but he had written beautiful poetry and had recited it, didn't read it, but recited it to Jason. And Jason was like enthralled by the poetry. And he couldn't resist. He said, do me a favor, clean up this table. I want to show you a Bible. Goes out to the trunk of his car, brings the volume, I think it was the Pentateuch volume, into McDonald's. And that's where the story picks up. I've put the glasses on purely for drama effect. Actually, I need them. By the way, the homeless former addict, his name is Michael. So Michael started asking me all sorts of questions about the meaning of each illumination that we explored together. Soon an elderly woman joined us at the table where I was giving my impromptu presentation. While Michael turned pages, I asked her about herself, and she hesitated and said, well, I'm a widow, and I don't like to leave home much. Sometimes I come here to watch TV at night when all the kids are gone and it's quiet. But tonight I heard the most wonderful poetry from Michael, and now I get to see this amazing Bible. As I looked on and answered the questions, Michael and this elderly woman turned pages and read scripture to each other. Clearly the staff could tell something strange was going on in this booth. First one teen walked over and peeked shyly, then another, then all of them, a half dozen at least. They listened to Michael and the widow read from the Bible. Their manager came over angry that their staff had left their posts at McDonald's and were standing around a table. That is, until she saw us looking at this enormous handwritten Bible. Apparently not all of the teens could read or speak English, so as this strange blend of people touched pages, asked questions, and read scripture aloud to each other, one girl would translate the words into Spanish. That's how the St. John's Bible shut down a McDonald's one night and transformed it into a church whose members included a homeless drug addict, a lonely widow, a bunch of immigrant children, a harried restaurant manager, and me. Our communion table had a McDonald's logo on it. We broke cheeseburgers together and drank diet soda. I know that Jesus was present in each face at that table. Jason's a great guy. By the way, at the time of this presentation, his wife was going through chemo and she's recovered and doing great, but you get a sense for how the faith keeps him going. All right, last encounter. Illuminating encounter number 10, to err is human. So the illumination, so the question people often ask is, what happens if there's a mistake made? And the little mistake is not bad. You can use a penknife and take off a line or two and burnish and polish the vellum and then start over. Not a big deal. The bigger mistake is the one I liken to me working on a term paper in college back in the late 70s, early 80s. So here's the scenario. It's 2 a.m. Your term paper is due at 8. You've got all these index cards from which you've created your term paper. One of the most critical points is somehow under your desk that should have been on page 6, and you're now on page 20, and you footnoted everything. How do you get that in, right? That's a problem. Well, the scribes had a bigger problem. Let's say you're working on a page in March, and then you don't find out until October that you've left out something, okay? Well, medieval scribes had exactly the same problem as we did, in that that's what happened on this page. So this verse, which ironically, which is almost too good to be true, it says, I called on God and the spirit of wisdom came to me. Apparently not soon enough. And what the artist did was, well, to get it back to where it's supposed to be, they drew a box around it, then you have this pulley, sort of Da Vinci pulley system, and the bumblebee is hoisting this line up and pointing to where it was supposed to be. There are 9 mistakes like that in the St. John's Bible. Each one is handled in kind of a whimsical way, and the homily is, hey, lighten up. Let's not take ourselves so serious. We're going to mess up. Let's fix it and move on. Here's the encounter I want to talk about, though. So this is an illumination by Thomas Engelmeyer, and it was on exhibit at the Library of Congress. Now, you have to realize these illuminations have been vetted by committees and scholars and so forth before they're approved, and this one got through. And this class full of kids, they were like 4th or 5th grade, and sure enough, this 5th grade young lady raises her hand. She goes, hey, there's a misspelling. They go, what? And sure enough, we zoom it in over here. The word across is spelled with 2 C's. And they decided, you know what, we're just going to leave it in. We're not saying this is a perfect Bible. This is a Bible made by human hands. Lighten up, everybody, and let's just go with it. And oh, by the way, printed Bibles have made mistakes. And so curators, this is a little blurry, but I apologize. This is called the Wicked Bible. It came out in the 16th century, and it was one that was released. And this is almost too suspicious. It says, thou shalt commit adultery. So I can see in today's era maybe, but maybe not in the 16th century. So the king tried to get all these volumes back, but they've now become a huge collector's item. So they're in the Museum of the Bible has one, and Houston Baptist University has a set. And anyway, so printed Bibles make mistakes as well.